Chapter 18. Katarina. As soon as the king's army approached Arras, Guy repeated all the precautions that had before been taken, but as this time there had been long warning, these were carried out more effectually. A considerable number of the cattle and sheep of the tenants were driven to Calais, and there sold. The rest, with the horses, were taken into the castle. The crops were hastily got in, for it was near July, and these were thrashed and the grain brought in, with the household furniture and all belongings. A great store of arrows had been long before prepared, and Guy felt confident that he could hold out for a long time. The women and children took up their abode in the castle, and the former were all set to work to make a great number of sacks. 100 cartloads of earth were brought in, and this was stored in a corner of the courtyard. The earth was to be employed in filling the sacks, which were to be lowered from the walls so as to form a protection against heavy missiles should an attempt be made to effect a breach. A few days after the king's army sat down before Arras, the lookout informed Guy that a horseman, together with a lady and 2 attendants, were riding towards the castle. Wondering who these visitors could be, Guy crossed the drawbridge to the outwork, where a small party were now stationed. As they rode up, he saw to his surprise and pleasure that they were the Count of Montepone and his daughter. He ran out to meet them. "I am delighted to see you, Count, and you also, Mistress Katarina. I regret that Sir Eustace and Dame Margaret are not here to receive you properly." "We were aware that she was absent," the count said as he dismounted, while Guy assisted Katarina from her saddle. "I received a letter 3 months since. It came by way of Flanders from Sir Eustace, expressing his thanks for what slight services I had rendered to his wife. He told me that they had crossed over to England, and that you were his castellan here, but I thought that ere this he might have returned." "I heard from him but a few days ago," Guy said. "He is detained in England by the illness of Dame Margaret, or he would have hastened hither on hearing that the French army was moving north. I need scarcely ask how you are, Mistress Katarina, for you have changed much, and, if I may say it without offence, for the better." The girl flushed a little and laughed, and her father said, "It is nigh 3 months since we left Paris. The country air has done her good. Since we left she has till now been in disguise again, and has ridden as my page, for I could not leave her behind, nor could I, in an army with so many wild and reckless spirits, take her in the dress of a girl." By this time they had crossed the drawbridge, the servants leading their horses after them. "My stay must be a short one," the count said as they entered the banqueting hall, and Guy gave orders for a repast to be served. "I hoped that you were come to stay for a time, Count. I would do all in my power to make your visit a pleasant one." The Italian shook his head. "No, I must ride back tonight. I have come here for a double purpose. In the first place, I must send Katarina to England. She is almost a woman now, and can no longer wander about with me in times like these. In the second place, I have come to tell you that I think you need have no fear of an attack upon the castle. That news you gave me, which enabled me to save those 3 Orleanist nobles, has added to what I had before done in that way, helped me vastly. One of them is a great favourite with Aquitaine, and the latter took me under his special protection, and he and many other great lords, and I may tell you, even the queen herself consulted me frequently. Shortly after you left I moved to a larger house, and there was no longer any need for me to assume the character of a vendor of medicines. I abandoned that altogether, and took handsome apartments with my negro from the booth to open the door, and 2 other lackeys. My knowledge of the stars has enabled me with some success to predict the events that have taken place, and Aquitaine and the queen have both implicit confidence in me, and undertake nothing without my advice. The Duke of Orleans, too, has frequently consulted me. I have used my influence to protect this castle. I have told them that success will attend all their efforts, which it was easy enough to foresee, as Burgundy has no army in the field that can oppose them. But I said that I had described a certain point of danger. It was some time before I revealed what this was, and then said that it appeared to me that the evil in some way started from the west of Arras. I would go no farther than this for many days, and then said that it arose from a castle held by one who was not altogether French, and that were an attack made upon it, evil would arise. I saw that it would lead to a disturbance, I said, in the negotiations for the marriage, and perhaps the arrival of an English army. More than this, I said, the stars did not tell me. Aquitaine made inquiries, and soon found that my description applied to Villeroy, and he and the queen have issued strict orders that no plundering party is to come in this direction, and that on no account is the castle to be interfered with, and I shall take care that their intentions in this matter are not changed. I had the royal orders to accompany the army. This I should have done in any case, but of course I professed a certain reluctance by saying that I had many clients in Paris. However, I received various rich presents, and was therefore prevailed upon to travel with them." "I thank you most heartily, Count, for, as you saw on crossing the courtyard, I have already called all the vassals in and made preparations to stand a siege. As to your daughter, I will, if you wish it, appoint 2 of the tenants' daughters as her attendants, and send an elderly woman as her companion with an escort under Robert Picard, one of those who were with me in Paris, and 4 other men at arms to accompany her to Summerley, and hand her over to the charge of Dame Margaret, who will, I trust, be in better health than when Sir Eustace wrote to me. It will be a great relief to our lord and lady to know that their presence is not urgently required here. The escort can start tomorrow at daybreak if you wish that they should do so." The Count hesitated, and Guy went on: "I will appoint the woman and the 2 maids at once. Mistress Katarina can occupy Dame Margaret's chamber, and the woman and the maids can sleep in those adjoining it." "That will do well," the Count said cordially. "We have ridden 20 miles already, and she could hardly go on today, while if she starts at daybreak they may reach Calais tomorrow. I will give Picard a letter to the governor, asking him in my lord's name to give honourable entertainment to the young lady, who is under Dame Margaret's protection, and to forward her upon her journey to join them by the first vessel sailing to Southampton. If there be none sailing thither, to send her at once by ship to Dover, whence they can travel by land. One of the 4 men at arms shall be an Englishman, and he can act as her spokesman by the way." "That will do most excellently," the Count said, "and I thank you heartily. As soon as I have finished my meal I must ride for the camp again. I start early this morning in order not to be observed. In the first place because I did not wish my daughter to be seen in her female dress, and in the second because I would not that any should notice my coming in this direction, and indeed we rode for the first mile backward along the road to Bapaume, and I shall return by the same way." "What will the end of these troubles be, Count?" "As I read the stars there will be peace shortly, and indeed it is clear to me that the Duke of Burgundy must by this time see that if the war goes on he will lose all Artois and perhaps Flanders, and that therefore he must make peace, and perhaps keep it until the royal army has marched away and dispersed. After that we may be sure that the crafty Duke will not long remain quiet. I have a trusty emissary in Burgundy's household, and as soon as the Duke comes to the conclusion that he must beg for peace I shall have intelligence of it, and shall give early news to the Queen and to Aquitaine, who would hail it with gladness, for, seeing that the latter's wife is Burgundy's daughter, he does not wish to press him hard, and would gladly see peace concluded." An hour later the Count rode off with his 2 followers, after taking an affectionate leave of his daughter, and telling her that it would not be long before he joined her, if only for a time, in England. Before he went, Guy had chosen the woman who, with her 2 daughters, was to accompany Katarina, and had installed them in the private apartments. "What shall we do with ourselves for the day?" he asked the girl, who was, he saw, shy and ill at ease now that her father had left. "If you are not tired we might take a ride. We have some hawks here, and now that the harvest has been gathered we shall doubtless find sport with the game birds." "Oh, I am not at all tired," she said eagerly, "and should like that much." Calling upon Long Tom and another to accompany them, horses were brought up, and they started and remained out until supper time, bringing home with them some 7 or 8 partridges that had been killed by the hawks. Guy suggested that perhaps she would prefer to have the meal served in her own apartments and retire to bed early. She accepted the offer, and at once went to her room, which she did not leave again that evening. Guy, as he ate alone, wondered to himself at the change that some 9 or 10 months had made in her. "I suppose she feels strange and lonely," he said to himself. "She was merry enough when we were out hawking, but directly we got back again she seemed quite unlike herself. I suppose it is because I always used to treat her as if she were a boy, and now that she has grown up into a woman she wants to forget that time." The town of Arras resisted sturdily. The garrison made frequent sorties, took a good many prisoners, and inflicted heavy loss upon the besiegers before these could gather in sufficient numbers to drive them in again, and all assaults were repulsed with loss. The castle of Bellemoute, near Arras, also repulsed all the efforts of the king's army to take it. Foraging party of Orleanists committed terrible devastations in the country round, but gained no advantage in their attacks on any fortified place. On the 29th of August the Duke of Brabant arrived with some deputies from Flanders to negotiate a peace between Burgundy and the king. They were well received, and an armistice was at once arranged. The French troops were suffering severely from disease, and the failure of all their attempts to capture Arras made them ready to agree willingly upon a peace. This was accordingly concluded on the 4th of September, and the next day the royal army marched away. 3 weeks after Katarina had gone to England, Sir Eustace himself, to Guy's great joy, arrived at the castle, bringing with him his esquire and 8 men-at-arms, as well as the 3 serving women and their escort. As soon as his pennon was seen, Guy leapt on a horse that was standing saddled in the courtyard, and rode to meet him. As he came up he checked his horse in surprise, for his father was riding by the side of Sir Eustace. Recovering himself, however, he doffed his cap to his lord. "Welcome back, my lord," he said. "I trust that our dear lady is better." "Much better, Guy. You see, I have brought your father over with me." Guy bent low to his father. "I am right glad to see you, and to hear such good accounts of you. Dame Margaret and Mistress Agnes were never tired of singing your praises, and in truth I was not weary of hearing them." "Are you going to make a long stay, father?" "I shall stay for some little time, Guy. Our lady is going to be her own castellan for the present, and in truth things are so quiet in England that Summerley could well go on without a garrison, so Sir Eustace suggested that I should accompany him hither, where, however, just at present things have also a peaceful aspect. The young countess arrived safely, Guy, and was heartily welcomed, the more so since, as your letter told me, it is to her father that we owe it that we do not have the king's army battling our walls, or even, if they did not try that, devastating the fields and ruining the farmers." By this time they were at the gate. Long Tom had the garrison drawn up in the courtyard, and they hailed the return of their lord with hearty cheers, while the retainers of Summerley were no less pleased at seeing Sir John Aylmer. "And now, Guy," said Sir Eustace, "I will tell you why I have come hither. It is partly to see after the estate, to hear the complaints of my vassals, and to do what I can for them, and in the next place I wanted to see these fortifications that you have raised, and thirdly, I shall shortly ride to Paris in the train of the Earl of Dorset, the Lord Grey, Admiral of England, some bishops, and many other knights and nobles, amounting in the whole to 600 horse. They go to treat for the marriage of the Princess of France with the English king. I had an audience with the king at Winchester as soon as we heard that the royal army was marching towards Artois, and he gave assurance that he would instruct the governor of Calais to furnish what assistance he could should the castle be attacked, and that he himself would at once, on hearing of it, send a remonstrance to the King of France, urging that I, as a vassal of his as well as of France, had avoided taking any part in the troubles, and had ever borne myself as a loyal vassal of his Majesty. The king was at Winchester when the young countess arrived, and I rode over to him to tell him that I had news that it was not probable that Villeroy would be attacked. It was then that his Majesty informed me that the Earl of Dorset, with a large body of nobles, would ere long cross the Channel for the purpose that I have named, and begged me to ride with them. The king, being disengaged at the time, talked with me long, and questioned me as to the former defence of the castle, and how Dame Margaret had fared when, as he had heard, she was obliged to go as a hostage to Paris. I told him all that had befallen her, at which he seemed greatly interested, and bade me present you to him at the first opportunity. "He must be a lad after my own heart," the king said, "and he shall have an opportunity of winning his spurs as soon as may be, which perchance is not so far away as some folks think." Guy thanked Sir Eustace for having so spoken of him to the English king, and asked, "What do you think he meant by these last words, my lord?" "Oh, that I cannot say, Guy, but it may well be that he thinks that this marriage, which has been so long talked of, may not take place, and that the negotiations have been continued solely for the purpose of keeping him quiet, while France was busying with her own troubles. Moreover, I know that the king has been already enlisting men, that he is impatient at having been put off so often with soft words, and that embassy is intended to bring matters to a head. Therefore, if, as I gathered from some of my friends at his court, he is eager for fighting, it may be that his ambassadors will demand conditions which he is sure beforehand the King of France will not grant. At any rate, I shall ride with Dorset to Paris. Whatever the sentiments of the Burgundians or Orleanists may be toward me will matter nothing, riding as I shall do in the train of the Earl. I am going to take you with me, as well as John Harpen, for I must do as well as others, and have had to lay out a goodly sum in garments fit for the occasion, for the king is bent upon his embassy making a brave show. Your father will be castellan here in my absence. I shall also take with me Long Tom and 4 of his archers, and 5 French men-at-arms. I have brought some Lincoln green cloth to make fresh suits for the archers, and also material for those for the men-at-arms." Both Sir Eustace and Sir John Aylmer expressed great satisfaction at the manner in which the new outworks had been erected. "Assuredly it is a strong castle now, Sir Eustace," Sir John said, "and would stand a long siege even by a great army." "What is all that earth for in the corner, Guy?" Sir Eustace asked, as they re-entered the castle after having made a survey of the new works. "I had that brought in, my lord, to fill sacks, of which I had 300 made, so that if guns and battering machines were brought against us, we might cover the wall at the place they aimed at, with sacks hanging closely together, and so break the force of the stones or the cannon balls." "Excellently well arranged, Guy. You thought, Sir John, that I was somewhat rash to leave the defence solely to the charge of this son of yours, but you see the lad was ready at all points, and I will warrant me that the castle would have held out under him as long a time as if you and I both had been in command of it." It was not until January, the year being 1414, that the Earl of Dorset and a great company arrived at Calais. As they passed not far from the castle, they were joined by Sir Eustace and his retinue. The king's wishes had been carried out, and the knights and nobles were so grandly attired, and their retinues so handsomely appointed, that when they rode into Paris the people were astonished at the splendour of the spectacle. A few days after they reached the capital, the king gave a great festival in honour of the visitors, and there was a grand tournament, at which the king and all the princes of the blood tilted. The English ambassadors were splendidly entertained, but their proposals were considered inadmissible by the French court, for Henry demanded, with Catherine, the duchy of Normandy, the county of Poitou, and the duchy of Aquitaine. No direct refusal was given, but the king said that he would shortly send over an embassy to discuss the conditions. Many handsome presents were made to all the knights and noblemen, and the embassy returned to England. Sir Eustace left them near Villeroy with his party, and stayed 2 days at the castle. Sir John Aylmer said that he would prefer that Guy should return home with Sir Eustace, and that he himself should remain as castellan, for he thought that there was little doubt that war would soon be declared. He said that he himself was too old to take the field on active service, and preferred greatly that Guy should ride with Sir Eustace. Long Tom made a petition to his lord that he too should go to England for a time. "If there is any immediate chance of fighting here, my lord," he said, "I would most willingly remain, but seeing that at present all is quiet, I would fain return, were it but for a month, for I have a maid waiting for me, and have, methinks, kept her long enough, and would gladly go home and fetch her over here." The request was at once granted, and Sir Eustace, his 2 esquires, and the archer rode to Calais, and crossed with the company of the Earl of Dorset. For some months Guy remained quietly at Summerley. Agnes, though nearly 16, was still but a young girl, while Katarina had grown still more womanly during the last 6 months. The former always treated him as a brother, but the latter was changeable and capricious. Occasionally she would laugh and chat when the three were alone, as she had done of old in Paris, but more often she would tease and laugh at him, while sometimes she would be shy and silent. "I cannot make out the young countess, my lady," he said to Dame Margaret, when Katarina had been teasing him even more than usual. "She was never like this in Paris, and I know not what I have done ought to offend her, that she should so often pick up my words and berate me for a meaning they never had." "You see things have changed since then," Dame Margaret said with a smile. "'Tis 2 years since you were in Paris, and Katarina, although but little older than Agnes, is already a young woman. You were then still under 17, now you are 19, and in growth and stature well nigh a man. You can hardly expect her to be the same with you as when she was running about Paris in boy's attire, for then you regarded her rather as a comrade than as a girl. I think perhaps it is that she a little resents the fact that you knew her in that guise, and therefore feels all the less at her ease with you. Do not trouble about it. The thing will right itself in time, and besides, you will be shortly going off to war." In fact, preparations were being already made for it. A French embassy of nobles and knights with 350 horsemen had come over, and after passing through London had gone to Winchester, and there met the king and his great lords. The Archbishop of Bourges, who was their spokesman, at once set forth that the king could not hand over so large a portion of his kingdom, but that he would give, with his daughter, large estates in France, together with a great sum in ready money. This offer was refused, and preparations for war went on in both countries. France was indeed but in poor condition to defend herself, for the Duke of Aquitaine had seriously angered both parties. He had made a pretext to get the great lords to ride out from Paris, he being with them, but he had secretly returned, and had ordered the gates to be closed, had called the citizens to arms, and had resumed the supreme authority of the realm. Having done this, he sent his wife, Burgundy's daughter, to a castle at a distance, and surrounding himself with young nobles as reckless and dissipated as himself, led a life of disorder, squandering money on his pleasures, and heavily taxing the city for his wants. The Duke of Burgundy, indignant at the treatment of his daughter, sent an ambassador to demand that she should be taken back, and that all the persons, 500 in number, who had been exempted from the terms of the treaty should be allowed to return to Paris. Both requests were refused, and the consequence was that the Duke of Burgundy, with his partisans, returned to his own country in deep anger. He would take no part in the war against the English, although he permitted his vassals to do so. In July the English levies gathered at Southampton. The king was to have embarked immediately, and a great fleet had been collected for the purpose, but as he was on the point of sailing, Henry obtained news of a plot against his life on the part of Sir Thomas Grey, Lord Scroop, and Richard, Earl of Cambridge, the king's cousin. As Scroop was in constant attendance upon the king and slept in his room, the conspirators had little doubt that their purpose could be carried out, their intention being to proclaim the Earl of March king, and to summon assistance from Scotland. The 3 conspirators were tried by a jury, and were all found guilty. Grey was beheaded, but his companions claimed to be tried again by their peers. No time was lost in carrying out the trial. All the lords assembled at Southampton were called together, and after hearing the evidence, at once found the 2 nobles guilty, and they were immediately beheaded. Orders were then given for the embarkation. Sir Eustace has brought with him 30 archers and as many men at arms, and as they were waiting on the strand for the boats that were to take them out to the ships to which they had been appointed, the king, who was personally superintending the operations, rode past. Sir Eustace saluted him. "Is this your following, Sir Eustace?" the king asked. "It is, my lord king, and would that it were larger. Had we landed at Calais, I should have been joined by another 50 stout Englishmen from Villeroy, and should we in our moss near it, I will draw them to me. Your Majesty asked me to present to you my esquire, Guy Aylmer, who, as I had the honour of telling you, showed himself a brave and trusty gentleman when, during the troubles, he was in Paris with my wife. Step forward, Guy." The latter did so, saluted the king, and stood erect in military attitude. "You have begun well," the king said graciously, "and I hereby request your lord that in the day of battle he will permit you to fight near me, and if you bear yourself as well when fighting for your king as you did when looking after your lady mistress, you shall have your share of honours as well as of blows." The king then rode on, and Sir Eustace and Guy took their places in a boat where the men had already embarked. "This is something like, Master Guy," said Long Tom, who was in command of the archers. "It's well indeed that I asked to come home to England when I did, else had I been now mewed up at Villeroy while my lord was writing the French in the open field. Crecy was the last time an English king commanded an army in battle against France. Think you that we shall do as well this time?" "I trust so, Tom. Methinks we ought assuredly not to do worse. It is true that the French have been having more fighting of late than we have, but the nobles are less united now than they were then, and are likely to be just as headstrong and incautious as they were at Crecy. I doubt not that we shall be greatly outnumbered, but numbers go for little unless they are well handled. The Constable d'Albret is a good soldier, but the nobles, who are his equals in rank, will heed his orders but little when their blood is up and they see us facing them. We may be sure, at any rate, that we shall be well led, for the king has had much experience against the Scotch and the Welsh, and has shown himself a good leader as well as a brave fighter. I hope, Tom, that you have by this time come to be well accustomed to your new bow." "That have I. I shot 80 arrows a day with it from the time I reached home, not even omitting my wedding day, and I think that now I make as good shooting with it as I did with my old one. 'Tis a pity we are not going to Calais. If we had been joined by 30 archers there we should have made a brave show, and more than that, they would have done good service, for they are picked men. A few here may be as good, but not many. You see, when we last sailed with our lord the times were peaceful, and we were able to gather the best shots for 50 miles around. But now that the king and so many of the nobles are all calling for archers, we could not be so particular, and have had to take what we could get. Still, I would enlist none who were not fair marksmen." This conversation took place as they were dropping down Southampton waters. Their destination was known to be Harfleur, which, as it was strongly fortified and garrisoned, was likely to offer a sturdy resistance. The fleet was a great one, consisting of from 12 to 1400 sail, which the king had collected from all the ports of England and Ireland, or hired from Holland and Friesland. The army consisted of 6,500 horsemen and 24,000 footmen of all kinds. On the 13th of August the fleet anchored in the mouth of the Seine, 3 miles from Harfleur. The operation of landing the great army and their horses occupied 3 days, the French, to the surprise of all, permitting the operation to be carried on without let or hindrance, although the ground was favourable for their attacks. As soon as the landing was effected, the army took up its position, so as to prevent any supplies from entering the town. They had with them an abundance of machines for battering the walls, and these were speedily planted, and they began their work. The garrison had been reinforced by 400 knights and picked men at arms, and fought with great determination and valour, making several sorties from the 2 gates of the town. There were, however, strong bodies of troops always stationed near to guard the engines from such attacks, and the French sorties were not only repulsed, but their knights had much difficulty in winning their way back to the town. The enemy were unable to use their cannon to much effect, for a large supply of gunpowder sent by the French king was, on the day after the English landed, captured on its way into the town. The besiegers lost, however, a good many men from the crossbowmen who manned the walls, although the English archers endeavoured to keep down their shooting by a storm of arrows. The most formidable enemy, however, that the English had to contend with was dysentery, brought on by the damp and unhealthy nature of the ground upon which they were encamped. No less than 2,000 men died, and a vastly larger number were so reduced by the malady that they were useless for fighting. The siege, however, was carried on uninterruptedly. The miners who had been brought over drove 2 galleries under the walls, and the gates were so shattered by stones and cannon balls that they scarcely hung together. The garrison surrendered at Harfleur, after having, by the permission of the English king, sent a messenger to the King of France, who was at Vernon, to say that unless they were succoured within 3 days they must surrender, as the town was already at the mercy of the English, and received for answer that no army was as yet gathered that could relieve them. In addition to the ravages of dysentery, the English army had suffered much from want of food. Large bodies of French troops were gathered at Rouen and other places, and when knights and men at arms went out to forage, they fell upon them and drove them back. Still a large amount of booty was gathered, together with enough provisions to afford a bare subsistence to the army. A considerable amount of booty was also obtained when Harfleur fell. The greater portion of the inhabitants of the town were forced to leave it, the breaches in the walls were repaired, and new gates erected. A portion of the treasure obtained was divided by the king among the troops. The prisoners and the main portion of the booty, which, as Harfleur was the chief port of Normandy, and indeed of all the western part of France, was very great, he sent direct to England, together with the engines of war. The sick and ailing were then embarked on ships with a considerable fighting force under the Earl of Warwick. They were ordered to touch at Calais, where the fighting men were to be landed and the sick carried home, and Henry then prepared to march to Calais by land. Chapter 19. Agincourt. The English king waited some time for an answer to a challenge he had sent to the Duke of Aquitaine to decide their quarrel by single combat, but Aquitaine cared more for pleasure than for fighting, and sent no answer to the cartel. It was open to Henry to have proceeded by sea to Calais, and it was the advice of his councillors that he should do so, but the king declared that the French should never say that he was afraid to meet them, and that as the country was his by right, he would march wherever he pleased across it. And so, after leaving 1,000 archers and 500 men at arms under the command of the Duke of Exeter, he set out on the 6th of October on his adventurous journey. Accounts differ as to the number that started with him. Some French historians put it as high as 17,000, but it is certain that it could not have exceeded 9,000 men, of whom 2,000 were men at arms and the rest archers. Now, while the siege of Harfleur had been going on, the arrangements for the embarkation of the troops and stores carried out, and the town put in a state of defence, troops had been marching from all points of France at the command of the French king to join him at Rouen, so that here and in Picardy 2 great armies were already assembled, the latter under the command of the Constable. The English force marched by the seashore until it arrived at the river Somme. No great resistance was encountered, but large bodies of the enemy's horse hovered near, and cut off all stragglers, and rendered it difficult to obtain food, so that sickness again broke out among the troops. On reaching the Somme, Henry followed its left bank up, intending to cross at the ford of La Blanche Tache, across from Edward III had carried his army before fighting at Crécy. The French, as on the previous occasion, held the ford, but they this time had erected defences on each of the banks, and had strong posts driven into the bed of the river. Still ascending along the river bank, the English found every bridge broken and every ford fortified, when a great body of troops marched parallel with them on the right bank of the river. At Pont Saint Remy, Pontoux de Mer, and several other points they tried in vain to force a passage. 7 days were spent in these attempts. The troops, suffering terrible hardships, were disheartened at their failure to cross the river, and at finding themselves getting farther and farther from the sea. On the morning of the 19th, however, a ford was discovered which had not been staked. The English vanguard at once made a dash across it, repulsed its defenders on the other bank, and the whole army, with its baggage, which was of scanty dimensions, swarmed across the river. Sir Eustace, with his little force, now reduced to half its number, was, as it happened, in front of the army when the ford was discovered, and, followed by his 2 esquires and 10 mounted men-at-arms, dashed into the river, while the archers, slinging their bows behind them, drew their axes and followed. For a short time there was a desperate conflict, but as reinforcements hurried across, the fighting became more even, and the French speedily gave way. When the king had crossed, he thanked Sir Eustace for his prompt action. "Had you waited to send back for orders," he said, "the French would have come up in such numbers that the ford would not have been won without heavy loss, whereas by dashing across the moment it was discovered, you took the defenders by surprise and enabled us to get over without the loss of a single man." The constable, disconcerted at finding that all his plans for keeping the English on the left bank of the river Somme were foiled, fell back to St. Pol in Artois. Henry followed, but without haste. His small force was greatly reduced by sickness, while by this time the whole of the royal army had marched round and joined that of the constable. On the day after the passage had been effected, 3 heralds arrived in the English camp to acquaint the king with the resolution of the constable and of the Dukes of Orleans and Brabant to give his army battle before he reached Calais. Henry replied that fear of them would not induce him to move out of his way, or to change the order of his march. He intended to go on straight by the road to Calais, and if the French attempted to stop him it would be at their peril. He accordingly continued to advance at the same rate as before. The constable fell back from St. Pol and took up his post between the villages of Russenville and Agincourt, where, having received all the reinforcements he expected, he determined to give battle. On the 24th the English crossed the Ternois at Blangy, and soon afterwards came in sight of the enemy's columns. These fell back as he advanced, and towards evening he halted at the village of Maisoncelles, within half a mile of the enemy's position. Fortunately provisions had been obtained during the day's march. These were cooked and served out, and the English lay down to sleep. The king sent for Sir Eustace. "You know this ground well, I suppose, Sir Eustace," he said, "for your castle of Villeroy is not many miles distant." "Yes, 'tis but 6 miles away," the knight replied. "It is good ground to fight on, for facing it are fields, and on either flank of these are large woods, so that there will be little space for the enemy to move." "That's just what I would have," the king said. "Were they but half as strong as they are, I should feel confident that we should defeat them. Their numbers will hinder them, and the deep wet ground will hamper their movements. As for ourselves, I would not have a man more with me if I could. The fewer we are, the greater the glory if we conquer, while if we are defeated, the less the loss to England. Does your young esquire also know the ground, Sir Eustace?" "Yes, sir, he has, I know, often ridden here when hawking." "Well, then, let him go with 4 of my officers, who are about to reconnoitre the ground, and see where we had best fight." Guy was accordingly called up and started with the officers. He first took them up to the wood on the right of the French division, then they moved across its front at a distance of 50 yards only from the French line. The contrast between it and the English camp was great. In the latter, the English, all was quiet. The men, after a hearty meal, had laid down to sleep, heeding little the wet ground and falling rain, exhausted by their long marching, and in good spirits, desperate though the odds seemed against them, that they were next day to meet their foes. In the French camp all was noise and confusion. Each body of troops had come on the ground under its own commander, and shouts, orders, and inquiries sounded from all quarters. Many of the Frenchmen never dismounted all the night, thinking it better to remain on horseback than to lie down on wet ground. Great fires were lighted, and the soldiers gathered round these, warming themselves and drinking, and calculating the ransoms to be gained by the capture of the king and the great nobles of England. Knights and men-at-arms rode about in search of their divisions, their horses slipping and foundering in the deep clay. Passing along the line of the French army, Guy and the officers proceeded to the wood on the left, and satisfied themselves that neither there nor on the other flank had any large body of men been posted. They then returned and made their report to the king. Guy wrapped himself in his cloak, and lay down and slept until the moon rose at 3 o'clock, when the whole army awoke and prepared for the day's work. The English king ordered the trumpeters and other musicians who had been brought with the army to play merry tunes, and these, during the 3 hours of darkness, cheered the spirits of the men, and helped them to resist the depressing influence of the cold night air following upon their sleep on the wet ground. The French, on the other hand, had no manner of musical instruments with their army, and all were fatigued and depressed by their long vigil. The horses had suffered as much as the men from damp, sleeplessness, and want of forage. There was, however, no want of confidence in the French army. All regarded victory as absolutely certain. As the English had lost by sickness since they left Harfleur fully 1,000 men out of 9,000, and as against these were arrayed at least 100,000, some French historians estimate them at 150,000, comprising most of the chivalry of France, the latter might well regard victory as certain. There were, however, some who were not so confident. Among these was the old Duke of Berry, who had fought at Poitiers 60 years before, and remembered how confident the French were on that occasion, and how disastrous was the defeat. His counsel that the English should be allowed to march on unmolested to Calais had been scouted by the French leaders, but he had so far prevailed that the intention that Charles should place himself at the head of the army was abandoned. It would be better, the Duke had urged, to lose the battle than to lose the king and the battle together. As soon as day broke, the English were mustered and formed up, and 3 masses were celebrated at different points in order that all might hear. When this was done, the force was formed up into 3 central divisions and 2 wings, but the divisions were placed so close together that they practically formed but one. The whole of the archers were placed in advance of the men-at-arms. Every archer, in addition to his arms, carried a long stake sharpened at both ends, that which was to project above the ground being armed with a sharp tip of iron. When the archers had taken up their positions, these stakes were driven obliquely into the ground, each being firmly thrust in with the strength of 2 or 3 men. As the archers stood many lines deep, placed in open order, and so that each could shoot between the heads of the men in front of him, there were sufficient stakes in front of the line to form a thick and almost impassable chevaux de frise. The baggage and horses were sent to the rear, near the village of Maisoncelles, under a guard of archers and men-at-arms. When all the arrangements were made, the king rode along the line from rank to rank, saying a few words of encouragement to each group of men. He recounted to them the victories that they had won against odds as great as those that they had to encounter this day, and told them that he had made up his own mind to conquer or die, for that England should never have to pay ransom for him. The archers he fired especially by reminding them that when the Orleanists had taken Soissons a few months before, they had hung up like dogs 300 English archers belonging to the garrison. He told them that they could expect no mercy, for that as the French in other sieges had committed horrible atrocities upon their own countrymen and countrywomen, they would assuredly grant no mercy to the English, while the latter on their march had burned no town nor village, and had injured neither man nor woman, so that God would assuredly fight for them against their wicked foes. The king's manner, as much as his words, aroused the enthusiasm of the soldiers. His expression was calm, confident, and cheerful. He at least evidently felt no doubt of the issue. The Duke of Berry had most strongly urged on the council that the French should not begin the attack. They had done so at Crécy and Poitiers with disastrous effect, and he urged them to await the assault of the English. The latter, however, had no intention of attacking, for Henry had calculated upon the confusion that would surely arise when the immense French army, crowded up between the 2 woods, endeavoured to advance. The men were therefore ordered to sit down on the ground, and food and some wine were served out to them. The constable was equally determined not to move. The French therefore also sat down, and for some hours the two armies watched each other. The Constable had, however, some difficulty in maintaining his resolution. The Duke of Orleans and numbers of the hot-headed young nobles clamoured to be allowed to charge the English. He himself would gladly have waited until joined by large reinforcements under the Duke of Brittany and the Marshal de Loigny, who were both expected to arrive in the course of the day. As an excuse for the delay, rather than from any wish that his overtures should be accepted, he sent heralds to the English camp to offer Henry a free passage if he would restore Harfleur, with all the prisoners that he had made there and on his march, and resign his claims to the throne of France. Henry replied that he maintained the conditions he had laid down by his ambassadors, and that he would accept none others. He had, in fact, no wish to negotiate, for he too knew that the French would very shortly be largely reinforced, and that were he to delay his march even for a day or two, his army would be starved. Perceiving at last that the Constable was determined not to begin the battle, he sent off 2 detachments from the rear of his army, so that their movements should be concealed from the sight of the French. One of these, composed of archers, was to take post in the wood on the left hand of the French. The other was to move on through the wood, to come down in their rear, and to set on fire some barns and houses there, so to create a panic. He waited until noon, by which time he thought that both detachments would have reached the posts assigned to them, and then gave the orders for the advance. The archers were delighted when their commander, Sir Thomas Epringham, repeated the order. None of them had put on his armour, and many had thrown off their jerkins, so as to have a freer use of their arms, either for bow or axe. Each man plucked up his stake, and the whole moved forward in orderly array until within bowshot of the enemy. Then the archers again stuck their stakes into the ground, and taking up their positions as before, raised a mighty shout as they let fly a volley of arrows into the enemy. The shout was echoed from the wood on the French left, and the archers there at once plied their bows, and from both flank and front showers of arrows fell among the French. As originally formed up, the latter's van should have been covered by archers and crossbowmen, but from the anxiety of the knights and nobles to be first to attack, the footmen had been pushing back to the rear, a position which they were doubtless not sorry to occupy, remembering how at Crécy the crossbowmen had been trampled down and slain by the French knights, desirous of getting through them to attack the English. Therefore there stood none between the archers and the French array of knights, and the latter suffered heavily from the rain of arrows. Sir Clugnet de Brabant was the first to take the offensive, and with 1,200 men-at-arms charged down upon the archers with loud shouts. The horses, however, were stiff and weary from standing so long in order. The deep and slippery ground and the weight of their heavily armed riders caused them to stagger and stumble, and the storm of arrows that smote them as soon as they got into motion added to the disorder. So accurate was the aim of the archers that most of the arrows struck the knights on their helmets and visors. Many fell shot through the brain, and so terrible was the rain of arrows that all had to bend down their heads so as to save their faces. Many of the archers too shot at the horses. Some of these were killed and many wounded, and the latter swerving and turning aside added to the confusion. And when at length Sir Clugnet and the leaders reached the line of stakes in front of the archers, only about 150 of the 1,200 men were behind them. The horses drew up on reaching the hedge of stakes. Their riders could give them no guidance, for without deigning to move from their order, the archers continued to keep up their storm of arrows, which at such close quarters pierced all but the very finest armour, while it was certain death to the knights to raise their heads to get a glance at the situation. The horses, maddened with the pain of the arrows, soon settled the matter. Some turned and rushed off madly, carrying confusion into the ranks of the first division. Others galloped off to the right or left, and of the 1,200 men who charged, 3 only broke through the line of stakes, and these were instantly killed by the billhooks and axes of the archers. The second line of battle was now in disorder, broken by the fugitive men and horses of Sir Clugnet's party, smitten with the arrows to which they had been exposed as that party melted away, and by those of the English archers in the wood on their flank. The confusion heightened every moment as wounded knights tried to withdraw from the fight, and others from behind struggled to take their places in front. Soon the disorder became terrible. The archers plucked up their stakes and ran forward. The French line recoiled at their approach in order to get into fairer order, and the archers, with loud shouts of victory, slung their bows behind them, dropped their stakes, and with axe and billhook rushed at the horsemen. These were too tightly wedged together to use their lances, and as they had retired they had come into newly ploughed ground, which had been so soaked by the heavy rain that the horses sank in the deep mud to their knees, many almost to their bellies. Into the midst of this helpless crowd of armed men the English archers burst. Embarrassed by their struggling horses, scarcely able to wield their arms in the press, seeing but scantily, and that only in front through the narrow slits of their visors, the chivalry of France died almost unresistingly. The Constable of France and many of the higher nobles and most distinguished knights fell, and but few of the first line made their escape. These, passing through the second division in order to draw up behind, threw this also into some confusion. The Duke of Brabant, who had just arrived on the field, charged down upon the flank of the archers. These met him fearlessly, and he and most of those with him were killed. This fight had, however, given time to the second division to close up their ranks. The archers would have attacked them, but the king caused the signal for them to halt to be sounded, and riding up formed them in order again. The French were unable to take advantage of the moment to try and recover their lost ground, for their horses were knee deep in the ground, upon which they had all night been trampling, and into which the weight of their own and their riders' armour sunk them deeply. "Now, my lords," the king said, turning to those around him, "our brave archers have done their share, it is our turn." And then, as arranged, all dismounted and marched forward against the enemy. In accordance with his orders, Sir Eustace de Villeroy and Guy were posted close to the king, while John Harpen led the men-at-arms from Summerley. For a time the battle raged fiercely. In the centre fought the king with his nobles and knights, while the archers, who had most of them thrown off their shoes and were able to move lightly over the treacherous ground, threw themselves upon the enemy's flanks, and did dreadful execution there. In the centre, however, the progress of the English was slower. The French knights made the most desperate efforts to attack the king himself, and pressed forward to reach the royal banner. The king's brother, the Duke of Clarence, was wounded, and would have been killed had not the king himself with a few of his knights taken post round him, and kept off the attacks of his foes until he recovered his feet. Almost immediately afterwards a band of 18 knights, under the banner of the Lord of Croy, who had bound themselves by an oath to take or kill the king, charged down upon him. One of them struck him so heavy a blow on the head with a mace that the king was beaten to his knee, but his knights closed in round him, and every one of his assailants was killed. The Duke of Alençon next charged down with a strong following. He cut his way to the royal standard, and struck the Duke of York dead with a blow of his battle-axe. Henry sprung forward, but Alençon's weapon again fell, and striking him on the head, clipped off a portion of the crown which Henry wore round his helmet. But before the French knight could repeat the stroke, Guy Aylmer sprung forward and struck so heavy a blow full on the duke's visor that he fell from his horse dead. His fall completed the confusion and dismay among the French, and the second division of their army, which had hitherto fought gallantly, now gave way. Many were taken prisoners. The third division, although alone vastly superior in numbers to the English, seeing the destruction of the others, began to draw off. They had moved but a short distance when loud shouts were heard in the English rear. 2 or 3 French knights, with a body of several hundred armed peasants, had suddenly fallen upon the English baggage and horses which had been left at Maisoncelles. Many of the guard had gone off to join in the battle, so that the attack was successful, a portion of the baggage, including the king's own wardrobe, and a great number of horses being captured. Ignorant of the strength of the attacking party, Henry believed that it was the reinforcements under the Duke of Brittany that had come up. At the same moment the third division of the French, whose leaders were also similarly deceived, halted and faced round, believing that he was about to be attacked in front and rear by greatly superior forces. Henry gave the order that all prisoners should be killed, and the order was to a great extent executed before the real nature of the attack was discovered and the order countermanded. The third division of the French now continued its retreat, and the battle was over. There remained but to examine the field and see who had fallen. The king gave at once the name of Agincourt to the battle, as this village possessed a castle, and it was therefore the most important of those near which the fight had taken place. Properly the name should have been Agincourt, as this was the French spelling of the village. The loss of the French was terrible, and their chivalry had suffered even more than at Poitiers. Several of the relations of the French king were killed. The Duke of Brabant, the Count of Nevers, the Duke of Bar and his 2 brothers, the Constable and the Duke of Alençon, all perished. No less than 120 great lords were killed, and 8,000 nobles, knights, and esquires lost their lives, with some thousands of lower degree, while the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, and many others were taken prisoners. The accounts of the English loss differ considerably, the highest placing it at 1,600, the lowest at 1/4 of that number. The plunder taken by them in the shape of costly armour, arms, rich garments, and the trappings of horses was great, but of food there was but little. Many of the victors lay down supperless around the village of Maisoncelles. The knights who had led the peasants to the attack of the baggage train, instead of joining in the fight, and had thereby caused the unfortunate massacre of so many prisoners, fell into great disgrace among the French for their conduct, and were imprisoned for some years by the Duke of Burgundy. That evening the English king knighted many esquires and aspirants of noble families, among them Guy Aylmer, who was indeed the first to receive the honour. "No one fought more bravely than you did, young knight," the king said, as Guy rose to his feet after receiving the accolade. "I will see that you have lands to support your new dignity. Twice you were at my side when I was in the greatest danger, and none have won their spurs more fairly." John Harpen would also have been among those knighted, but he declined the honour, saying that he was not come of gentle blood, and wished for nothing better than to remain his lord's esquire so long as he had strength to follow him in the field. The next morning the army marched to Calais. The king turned aside with Sir Eustace, and with a strong party rode to Villeroy. Guy had gone on with the men at arms at daybreak, and a banquet had been prepared, and 20 carloads of grain and 100 bullocks sent off to meet the army on its march. "'Tis a fine castle, Sir Eustace," the king said as he rode in, "but truly it is perilously situated. If after this I can make good terms with France, I will see that the border shall run outside your estates; but if not, methinks that it were best for you to treat with some French noble for its sale, and I will see that you are equally well bestowed in England, for in truth after fighting for us at Agincourt you are likely to have but little peace here." "I would gladly do so, my lord king," Sir Eustace replied. "During the last 3 years it has been a loss rather than a gain to me. I have had to keep a large garrison here, the estate has been wasted, and the houses and barns burnt. Had it not been that there was for most of the time a truce between England and France, I should have fared worse. And now I may well be attacked as soon as your majesty and the army cross to England." "Oh, you will have a little breathing time," the king said. "They will have enough to do for a while to mourn their losses. I will not leave behind any of your brave fellows who have fought so hard here, but when I arrive at Calais will order 200 men of the garrison to come over to reinforce you until you can make arrangements to get rid of the castle, if it is not to remain within my territory." Sir Eustace introduced Sir John Aylmer as the father of the newly made knight. "You have a gallant son, Sir John," the king said, "and one who is like to make his way to high distinction. I doubt not that before we have done with the French he will have fresh opportunities of proving his valour." After the meal was over the king went round the walls. "'Tis a strong place," he said, "and yet, unless aid reached you, you could not resist an army with cannon and machines." "I have long seen that, your majesty, and have felt that I should have to choose between England and France, for that when war broke out again I could not remain a vassal of both countries." "It shall be my duty to show you that you have not chosen wrongly, Sir Eustace. I cannot promise to maintain you here, for you might be attacked when I have no army with which I could succour you. As soon as I return home and learn which of those who have fallen have left no heirs, and whose lands therefore have come into my gift, I will then make choice of a new estate for you." The army marched slowly to Calais. It was weakened by sickness and hunger, and every man was borne down by the weight of the booty he carried. On arriving there the king held a council, and it was finally determined to return to England. The force under his command was now but the skeleton of an army. Fresh men and money were required to continue the war, and he accordingly set sail, carrying with him his long train of royal and noble prisoners. The news of the victory created the greatest enthusiasm in England. At Dover the people rushed into the sea and carried the king to shore on their shoulders. At Canterbury and other towns through which he passed he received an enthusiastic welcome, while his entry into London was a triumph. Every house was decorated, the conduits ran with wine instead of water, and the people were wild with joy and enthusiasm. Great subsidies were granted him by Parliament, and the people in their joy would have submitted to any taxation. However, throughout his reign Henry always showed the greatest moderation. He kept well within constitutional usages, and his pleasant, affable manners secured for him throughout his reign the love and devotion of his subjects. On his arrival at Calais, Guy discovered that among the prisoners was his friend Count Charles d'Estournel. "I am grieved indeed to see you in this plight," he exclaimed as he met him. "'Tis unfortunate truly, Aylmer, but it might have been worse. Better a prisoner than among the dead at Agincourt," the light hearted young count said. "But truly it has been an awful business. Who could have dreamt of it? I thought myself that the council were wrong when they refused all the offers of the towns to send bodies of footmen to fight beside us. Had they been there, they might have faced those terrible archers of yours, for they at least would have been free to fight, when we were all but helpless in that quagmire. I see that you have knightly spurs on, and I congratulate you. Now, Count, what can I do to ensure your release at once? Whose prisoner are you?" "I am surrendered to one John Parsons, an esquire, and I shall, of course, as soon as we get to England, send home to raise money for my ransom." "Oh, I know him well," Guy said. "His lord's tent was pitched alongside that of Sir Eustace before Harfleur, and we saw much of each other, and often rode together on the march. If I gave him my guarantee for your ransom, I doubt not that he will take your pledge and let you depart at once." "I should be glad indeed if you would do so, Aylmer." "At any rate he will take the guarantee of Sir Eustace," Guy said, "which will, I know, be given readily after the service you rendered to his dame, and it may be that you will have it in your power to do him a service in return." He then told the count of the intention of Sir Eustace to sell the estate, or rather to arrange for its transfer. "It is held directly from the crown," he said, "but just at present the crown is powerless. Artois is everywhere Burgundian, and it would certainly be greatly to the advantage of Burgundy that it should be held by one of his followers, while it would be to the safety of France that it should be held by a Frenchman rather than by one who is also a vassal of England." "I should think that that could be arranged," the count said thoughtfully. "I will speak to my father. I am, as you know, his second son, but through my mother, who is German, I have an estate on the other side of the Rhine. This I would gladly exchange, that is to say, would part with to some German baron, if I could obtain the fief of Villeroy. I have no doubt that Burgundy would not only consent but would help, for, as you know by the manner in which your lady was made a hostage, he looked with great jealousy on this frontier fortress, which not only gives a way for the English into Artois, but which would, in the hands of an Orleanist, greatly aid an invasion of the province from Ponthieu and the west. And although the court would just at present object to giving the fief to a Burgundian, it is powerless to interfere, and when the troubles are over the duke would doubtless be able to manage it." Guy had no difficulty in arranging the matter with D'Estournel's captor, to whom Sir Eustace and he both gave their surety that his ransom should be paid, and before sailing Guy had the satisfaction of seeing his friend mount and ride for St. Omer, with a pass through the English territory from the governor. Chapter 20. Penshurst. After accompanying the king to London, Sir Eustace and Guy rode to Summerley, where Long Tom and his companions had already arrived, having marched thither direct from Dover. There were great rejoicings at the castle. Not only the tenants, but people from a long way round came in to join in welcoming home two of the heroes of Agincourt. The archer had already brought news of Guy having been knighted, and he was warmly congratulated by Dame Margaret and by Agnes, who received him with her usual sisterly affection. Katarina also congratulated him, but it was with less warmth of manner. In the evening, however, her mood changed, and she said to him, "Though I do not say much, you know that I am pleased, Sir Guy." "I am not sure, Countess Katarina, since we are to be ceremonious to each other, that I do quite know, for since I returned from France last time I have seldom understood you. One moment you seem to me just as you used to be, at another you hold me at a distance as if I were well nigh a stranger." Katarina shrugged her shoulders. "What would you have, Guy? One can't be always in the same humour." "You are always in the same humour to Dame Margaret and Agnes," he said. "So far as I can see, I am the only one whom you delight to tease." "Now that you are a belted knight, Sir Guy, I shall not presume to tease you any more, but shall treat you with the respect due to your dignity." Then she swept a deep curtsy, and turning went off with a merry laugh, while Guy looked after her more puzzled than ever. That evening he received the news that during the absence of Sir Eustace and himself, Sir William Bailey, a young knight whose estates lay near, had asked for the hand of Agnes, and that although Dame Margaret had been unable to give an answer during her lord's absence, Agnes would willingly submit herself to her father's orders to wed Sir William. Guy remained for some months quietly at Summerley. The Emperor Sigismund had paid a visit to England and then to Paris, to endeavour to reconcile the two countries. His mediation failed. Henry offered, as a final settlement, to accept the execution on the part of France of the Treaty of Trepigny. Nothing, however, came of it, for there was no government in France capable of making a binding treaty. In spite of the disgrace and the slaughter of the nobles at Agincourt, there was no abatement of the internal dissensions, and the civil war between Burgundy and Armagnac was still raging, the only change in affairs being that the vicious and incapable Duke of Aquitaine had died, and the queen had once again gone over to the Burgundian faction. Count Charles d'Estournel had carried into effect the mission with which he had charged himself. Burgundy had eagerly embraced the opportunity of attaching to his side the castles and estates of Villeroy, and he and the Count of Estournel, between them, raised a sum of money which was paid to Sir Eustace for the relinquishment to Burgundy of the fief, which was then bestowed upon Count Charles. The sum in no way represented what would now be considered the value of the estate, but in those days, when fiefs reverted to the crown or other feudal superior upon the death of an owner without heirs, or were confiscated upon but slight pretence, the money value was far under the real value of the estate. Sir Eustace was well satisfied, however, with the sum paid him. Had his son Henry lived, he had intended that the anomalous position of the Lord of Villeroy, being also a vassal of England, should have been got rid of by one of his sons becoming its owner, and a vassal of France, while the other would inherit Summerley and throw up a vassal of England only. Henry's death had put an end to the possibility of this arrangement, and Charlie would now become, at his father's death, Lord of Summerley and of such other English lands as could be obtained with the money paid for the surrender of the fief of Villeroy. In the first week of July there were great rejoicings at Summerley over the marriage of Agnes with Sir William Bailey. The king had not forgotten his promise to Sir Eustace, and had raised him to the title of Baron Eustace of Summerley, and had presented him with a royal manor near Winchester. Guy was summoned to court to take part in the festivities that were held during the visit of Sigismund, and the king said to him pleasantly one day, "I have not forgotten you, Sir Guy, but I have had many to reward, and you know importunate suitors, and those who have powerful connections to keep their claims ever in front, obtain an advantage over those who are content to hold themselves in the background." "I am always contented, your majesty. I have lived all my life in the household at Summerley, and am so much one of my lord's family that I have no desire to quit it. Moreover, my father has just returned from Villeroy with the garrison of the castle, and it is a great pleasure to me to have his society again." "I thought that some day you would have married Dame Margaret's fair daughter, after acting as their protector in the troubles in Paris, but I hear that she is betrothed to Sir William Bailey." "Oh, such an idea never entered my mind, your majesty. She was but a child in those days, not so much in years as in thought, and brought up together as we were, I have always regarded her rather in the light of a sister." Guy's quiet stay at Summerley came to an end suddenly. A fortnight after the marriage of Agnes, Harfleur was besieged by the French by land and water, and the Earl of Dorset, its governor, sent to England for aid. The king sent hasty orders to his vassals of Kent, Surrey, and Hampshire to march with their retainers to Rye, where a fleet was to gather for their conveyance. A body of archers and men-at-arms were also sent thither by the king, and the Duke of Bedford, his brother, appointed to the command of the expedition. Sir Eustace was suffering somewhat from the effects of a fever, the seeds of which he had contracted in France, and he accordingly sent his contingent, 30 archers and as many men-at-arms, under the command of Guy. "I had hoped that we had done with Harfleur," Long Tom said as they started on their march to the seaport. "I don't mind fighting, that comes in the way of business, but to see men rotting away like sheep with disease is not to my fancy." "We shall have no fighting on land, Tom," Guy replied; "at least I expect not. When the French see that the garrison is reinforced they will probably give up the siege, though we may have a fight at sea with the French ships that are blockading the town and preventing provisions from reaching the garrison. Doubtless we shall take a good store of food with us, and the French will know well enough that as we had such hard work in capturing the town they can have no choice whatever of taking it by assault when defended by us." Guy and his party had a small ship to themselves, with which he was well content, as being but a newly made knight he would, had he been in a large ship, have been under the orders of any others who chanced to be with him, while he was now free to act as he chose. The voyage was favourable, but when the fleet arrived off the mouth of the Seine they found that the work before them was far more serious than they had expected. In addition to their own fleet, which was itself considerably stronger than the English, the besiegers had hired the aid of some great Genoese vessels, and a number of galleys, caravels, and many high-decked ships from Spain. They occupied a strong position off the town, and could be supported by some of the siege batteries. The English fleet lay to at the mouth of the Seine, and at night the captains of the troops on board the various ships were rowed to Bedford's ship, which displayed a light at the masthead, so that the fleet could all lie in company round her. Here, after much discussion, a plan for the battle next day was agreed upon. The enterprise would have been a very hazardous one, but happily at daybreak the French ships were seen coming out to give battle. Confident in their superior numbers, and anxious to revenge their defeat at Agincourt, the French commanders were eager to reap the whole glory of victory without the assistance of their allies, whose ships remained anchored in the river. Bedford at once made the signal to attack them, and a desperate fight ensued. Great as was the slaughter in those days in battles on land, it was far greater in sea fights. Except to knights and nobles, from whom ransom could be obtained, quarter was never given to prisoners either by land or sea. Consequently, as soon as soldiers in a land battle saw that fortune was going against them, they fled. But on sea there was no escape. Every man knew that it was either death or victory, and therefore fought with determination and obstinacy to the end. The two first French ships that arrived were speedily captured, but when the rest came up a desperate battle took place. Guy was on the point of ordering his ship to be laid alongside a French craft little larger than his own, when his eye fell upon a great ship carrying the flag of a French admiral, and at once diverting the course of his vessel he ran alongside her. The archers were on the bow and stern castles of his ship, and as they came within a short distance of the Frenchman, they sent their arrows thick and fast into the crowded mass on her deck. 2 grapnels, to each of which were attached 20 feet of chain, were thrown into the shrouds of the French vessel, and Guy shouted to the men-at-arms in the waist to keep the enemy from boarding by holding the vessel apart, by thrusting out light spars and using their spears. The French had a few crossbowmen on board, but Guy, running up on to the castle at the bow, where Long Tom himself was posted, bade him direct the fire of his men solely against them, and in a very short time the discharge of missiles from the French ships ceased. In vain the French attempted to bring the ships alongside each other by throwing grapnels. The ropes of these were cut directly they fell, and although many of the English spears were hacked in two, others were at once thrust out, and the spars, being inclined so as to meet the hull of the enemy below the waterline, could not be reached by their axes. The wind was light, and there was no great difference in point of sailing. The English sailors were vigilant, and when the Frenchman brailed up his great sail so as to fall behind, they at once followed his example. At the end of a quarter of an hour the effect of the arrows of the 30 archers was so great that there was much confusion on board the enemy, and Guy thought that, comparatively small as his force was, an attack might be made. So the spars were suddenly drawn in and the chains hauled upon. The archers caught up their axes and joined the men-at-arms, and as the vessels came together they all leapt with a great shout upon the enemy's deck. The French knights, whose armour had protected them to some extent from the slaughter that the arrows had effected among the soldiers, fought bravely and rallied their men to resistance, but with shouts of Agincourt, the men-at-arms and archers led by Guy, who now for the first time fought in his knightly armour, were irresistible. They had boarded at the enemy's stern so as to get all their foes in front of them, and after clearing the stern castle they poured down into the waist and gradually won their way along it. After 10 minutes of hard fighting the French admiral and knights were pent up in the forecastle, and defended the ladder by which it was approached so desperately that Guy ordered Tom, with a dozen of the archers, to betake themselves to the English forecastle and to shoot from there, and in a short time the French leaders lowered their swords and surrendered. The French flag at the stern had been hauled down, and that of England hoisted as soon as they boarded, and the latter was now run up to the masthead amid the loud hurrahs of the English. The moment the French surrendered, Guy called to his men to cease from slaying and to disarm the prisoners, who were still much more numerous than themselves. The common men he told to take to their boats and row away, while the admiral and knights were conducted to the cabin and a guard placed over them. As soon as this was done, Guy looked round. The battle was still raging, and many of the French ships had been captured, but others were defending themselves desperately. 12 of Guy's men had been killed, and several of the others more or less severely wounded, and seeing that his countrymen did not need his assistance, he ordered the decks to be cleared and the dead bodies thrown overboard. In a quarter of an hour the last French ship had been taken. There was now breathing time for half an hour, during which the Duke of Bedford, whose ship lay not far from Guy's prize, had himself rowed on board. "All have done well today, Sir Guy Aylmer, but assuredly the feat you have performed surpasses any of the others, seeing that you have captured this great ship with one of the smallest in our fleet. Their crew must have been 3 or 4 times as strong as yours, which was, as I know, but 60 strong. Has the Count de Valor fallen?" "No, my Lord Duke. He is, with 6 of his knights, a prisoner in the cabin." "I will see him later," the Duke said. "We are now going to attack the Genoese and Spaniards. Is there aught that I can do for you?" "Some 20 of my men are dead or disabled," Guy said, "and I must leave 10 in charge of this prize. I have suffered the French soldiers, after disarming them and the sailors, to leave in their boats, and 10 men will therefore be sufficient to hold her. If your Grace can spare me 30 men at arms, I will go on in my own ship to attack the Genoese." "I will do so," the Duke replied. "I will send 10 to keep this ship, and 20 to fill the places of those of your men who have fallen. I can spare 10 from my own ship, and will borrow 20 from such of the others as can best spare them." In a few minutes the 30 men came on board, with a sub officer to take charge of the prize. Guy returned with his own men and 20 newcomers to his vessel, and sailed in with the fleet to attack the great ships of the Genoese and Spaniards at their moorings. As they approached they were received with a heavy cannonade from the enemy's ships and shore batteries, but without replying they sailed on and ranged themselves alongside the enemy, their numbers permitting them to lay a vessel on each side of most of the great caravels. Their task was by no means an easy one, for the sides of these ships were 15 feet above those of the low English vessels, and they were all crowded with men. Nevertheless the English succeeded in boarding, forcing their way in through portholes and windows, clambering up the bows by the carved work, or running out on their yards and swinging themselves by ropes onto the enemy's deck, while the cannon plied them with shot close to the water line. Most of the ships were taken by boarding, some were sunk with all on board, a few only escaped by cutting their cables and running up the Seine into shallow water. The loss of life on the part of the French and their allies in this brilliant British victory was enormous. With the exception of those on board the few ships which escaped, and the men sent off in the boats by Guy, the whole of the crews of the French, Genoese, and Spaniards, save only the nobles and knights put to ransom, were killed, drowned, or taken prisoners. And during the 3 weeks that the English fleet remained off Harfleur, the sailors were horrified by the immense number of dead bodies that were carried up and down by the tide. Harfleur was revictualled and put into a state of defence, and the Duke of Bedford then sailed with his fleet to England, having achieved the greatest naval victory that England had ever won, save when Edward III, with the Black Prince, completely defeated a great Spanish fleet off the coast of Sussex, with a squadron composed of ships vastly inferior both in size and number to those of the Spaniards, which contained fully 10 times the number of fighting men carried by the English vessels. This great naval victory excited unbounded enthusiasm in England. The king gave a great banquet to the Duke of Bedford and his principal officers, and by the Duke's orders Guy attended. Before they sat down to the table the Duke presented his officers individually to the king. Guy, as the youngest knight, was the last to be introduced. "The Duke has already spoken to me of the right valiant deeds that you accomplished, Sir Guy Aylmer," the king said as he bowed before him, "and that with but a small craft and only 60 men at arms and archers you captured the ship of the French admiral, which he estimates must have carried at least 300 men. We hereby raise you to the rank of Knight Banneret, and appoint you to the fief of Penshurst in Hampshire, now vacant by the death without heirs of the good knight Sir Robert Fulk. And we add thereto, as our own gift, the 2 royal manors of Stoneham and Piverley, lying adjacent to it, and we enjoin you to take for your coat of arms a great ship. The fief of Penshurst is a sign of our royal approval of your bravery at Harfleur. The 2 manors are the debt we owe you for your service at Agincourt. We have ordered our chancellor to make out the deeds, and tomorrow you will receive them from him and take the oaths." Guy knelt and kissed the hand that the king held out to him, and acknowledged the royal gift in fitting words. On the following day, after taking the oaths for his new possessions, he mounted, and the next day rode into Summerley. Here, to his surprise, he found the Count of Montepone, who had arrived by way of Calais and Dover a few days previously. He was suffering from a severe wound, and when Guy entered rose feebly from a chair by the fire, for it was now October and the weather was cold. His daughter was sitting beside him, and Lady Margaret was also in the room. Lord Eustace and Sir John Aylmer had met Guy as he dismounted below. "So you have gone through another adventure and come out safely," the count said after Guy had greeted him. "Truly you have changed greatly since you left Paris well nigh 3 years ago. It was well that Maître Leroux had the armour made big for you, for I see that it is now none too large. I too, you see, have been at war, but it was one in which there was small honour, though, as you see, with some risk, for it was a private duel forced upon me by one of the Armagnac knights. Up to that time my predictions had wrought me much profit and no harm. I had told Aquitaine and other lords who consulted me that disaster would happen when the French army met the English. That much I read in the stars, and though when Henry marched north from Harfleur with so small a following it seemed to me that victory could scarce attend him against the host of France, I went over my calculations many times and could not find that I had made an error. It was owing greatly to my predictions that the duke readily gave way when the great lords persuaded him not to risk his life in the battle. Others whom I had warned went to their death, in some cases because they disbelieved me, in others because they preferred death to the dishonour of drawing back. One of the latter, on the eve of the battle, confided to a hot-headed knight in his following that I had foretold his death, and instead of quarrelling with the stars, the fool seemed to think that I had controlled them and was responsible for his lord's death. So when in Paris some months since, he publicly insulted me, and, being an Italian noble as well as an astrologer, I fought him the next day. I killed him, but not before I received a wound that laid me up for months, and from which I have not yet fairly recovered. While lying in Paris, I decided upon taking a step that I had for some time been meditating. I could, when Katarina left Paris with your lady, have well gone with her, with ample means to live in comfort, and to furnish her with a fortune not unfitted to a rank as my daughter. During the past 3 years, the reputation I gained by my success in saving the lives of several persons of rank increased so rapidly that money has flowed into my coffers beyond all belief. There was scarcely a noble of the king's party who did not consult me, and since Agincourt, the Duke of Aquitaine and many others took no step whatever without coming to me. But I am weary of the everlasting troubles of which I can see no end, and assuredly the aspect of the stars affords no ground for hope that they will terminate for years. Therefore I have determined to leave France, and to practise my art henceforth solely for my own pleasure. I shall open negotiations with friends in Mantua to see whether, now that 12 years have elapsed since I had to fly, matters cannot be arranged with my enemies. Much can often be done when there are plenty of funds wherewith to soothe away difficulties. Still, that is in the future. My first object in coming to England was to see how my daughter was faring, and to enjoy a period of rest and quiet while my wound was healing, which it has begun to do since I came here. I doubted on my journey, which was been wholly performed in a litter, whether I should arrive here alive." "And now, father," Katarina said, "let us hear what Sir Guy has been doing since he left. We have been all full of impatience since the news came 4 days ago that the Duke of Bedford had destroyed a great fleet of French, Spanish, and Genoese ships." "Guy has had his share of fighting, at any rate," Lord Eustace said, as he entered the room while the girl was speaking, "for 15 of our men have fallen, and, as Long Tom tells me, they had hot work of it, and gained much credit by capturing single-handed a great French ship." "Yes, we were fortunate," Guy said, "in falling across the ship of the French admiral, Count de Valor. Our men all fought stoutly, and the archers having cleared the way for us and slain many of their crew, we captured them, and I hold the count and 5 French knights to ransom." "That will fill your purse rarely," Guy said. "But let us hear more of this fighting. De Val's ship must have been a great one, and if you took it with but your own 60 men it must have been a brilliant action." Guy then gave a full account of the fight, and of the subsequent capture of one of the Spanish carracks with the aid of another English ship. "If the Duke of Bedford himself came on board," Lord Eustace said, "and sent you some reinforcements, he must have thought highly of the action. Indeed, he cannot but have done so, or he would not have come personally on board. Did he speak to the king of it?" "He did, and much more strongly, it seems to me, than the affair warranted, for at the banquet the day before yesterday his majesty was graciously pleased to appoint me a knight banneret, and to bestow upon me the estates of Penshurst, adding hereto the royal manors of Stoneham and Piverley." "A right royal gift," Lord Eustace said, while exclamations of pleasure broke from the others. "I congratulate you on your new honour, which you have rightly and worthily earned. Sir John, you may well be proud of this son of yours." "I am so indeed," Sir John Aylmer said heartily. "I had hoped well of the lad, but had not deemed that he would mount so rapidly. Sir Richard Fulk had a fine estate, and joined now to the two manors it will be as large as those of Summerley, even with its late additions." "I am very glad," Dame Margaret said, "that the king has apportioned you an estate so near us, for it is scarce 15 miles to Penshurst, and it will be but a morning ride for you to come hither." "Methinks, wife," Lord Eustace said with a smile, "we were somewhat hasty in that matter of Sir William Bailey, for had we but waited, Agnes might have done better." "She chose for herself," Dame Margaret replied with an answering smile. "I say not that in my heart I had not hoped at one time that she and Guy might have come together, for I had learnt to love him almost as if he had been my own, and would most gladly have given Agnes to him had it been your wish as well as theirs. But I have seen for some time past that it was not to be, for they were like brother and sister to each other, and neither had any thought of a still closer relation. Had it not been so, I should never have favoured Sir William Bailey's suit, though indeed he is a worthy young man, and Agnes is happy with him. You have not been to your castle yet, Guy?" she asked, suddenly changing the subject. "No, indeed, Lady Margaret. I rode straight here from London, deeming this, as methinks that I shall always deem it, my home." "We must make up a party to ride over and see it tomorrow," Lord Eustace said. "We will start early, wife, and you and Katarina can ride with us. Charlie will of course go, and Sir John. We could make a horse litter for the count if he thinks he could bear the journey." "Methinks that I had best stay quietly here," the Italian said. "I have had enough of litters for a time, and the shaking might make my wound angry again. Nonsense, child," he broke off as Katarina whispered that she would stay with him. "I need no nursing now. You shall ride with the rest." Accordingly, the next day the party started early. Charlie was in high spirits. He had grown into a sturdy boy, and was delighted at the good fortune that had befallen Guy, whom he had regarded with boundless admiration since the days in Paris. Katarina was in one of her silent moods, and rode close to Lady Margaret. Long Tom, who was greatly rejoiced on hearing of the honours and estates that had been bestowed on Guy, rode with two of his comrades in the rear of the party. Penshurst was a strong castle, though scarcely equal in size to Summerley. It was, however, a more comfortable habitation, having been altered by the late owner's father, who had travelled in Italy, with a view rather to the accommodation of its inmates than its defence, and had been furnished with many articles of luxury rare in England. "A comfortable abode truly, Guy," his father said. "It was well enough 200 years since, when the country was unsettled, for us to pen ourselves up within walls, but there is little need of it now in England, although in France, where factions are constantly fighting against each other, it is well that every man should hold himself secure from attack. But now that cannon are getting to so great a point of perfection, walls are only useful to repel sudden attacks, and soon crumble when cannon can be brought against them. Methinks the time will come when walls will be given up altogether, especially in England, where the royal power is so strong that nobles can no longer war with each other." "However, Guy," Lord Eustace said, "'tis as well at present to have walls, and strong ones, and though I say not that this place is as strong as Villeroy, it is yet strong enough to stand a siege." Guy spent an hour with the steward who had been in charge of the castle since the death of Sir Richard Fulk, and who had the day before heard from a royal messenger that Sir Guy had been appointed lord of the estates. The new owner learned from him much about the extent of the feu, the number of tenants, the strength that he would be called upon to furnish in case of war, and the terms on which the vassals held their tenure. "Your force will be well nigh doubled," the steward said in conclusion, "since you tell me that the manors of Stoneham and Beverley have also fallen to you." "'Tis a fair country," Guy said as the talk ended, "and one could wish for no better. I shall return to Summerley today, but next Monday I will come over and take possession, and you can bid the tenants, and those also of the two manors, to come hither and meet me at 2 o'clock." "Well, daughter," the Count of Montepone said to Katarina as she was sitting by his couch in the evening, "so you think that Penshurst is a comfortable abode?" "Yes, father, the rooms are brighter and lighter than these, and the walls are all hung with arras and furnished far more comfortably." Wouldst thou like to be its mistress, child?" A bright flush of colour flooded the girl's face. "Dost mean it, father?" she asked in a voice hardly above a whisper. "Why not, child? You have seen much of this brave young knight, whom methinks any maiden might fall in love with. Art thou not more sensible to his merits than was Mistress Agnes?" "He saved my life, father." "That did he, child, and at no small risk to his own. Then do I understand that such a marriage would be to your liking?" "Yes, father," she said frankly, "but I know not that it would be to Sir Guy's." "That is for me to find out. I asked Lady Margaret a few days ago what she thought of the young knight's inclinations, and she told me that she thought indeed he had a great liking for you, but that in truth you were so wayward that you gave him but little chance of showing it." "How could I let him see that I cared for him, father, when I knew not for certain that he thought aught of me, and moreover I could not guess what your intentions for me might be?" "I should not have sent you where you would often be in his company, Katarina, unless I had thought the matter over deeply. It was easy to foresee that after the service he had rendered you, you would think well of him, and that, thrown together as you would be, it was like enough that you should come to love each other. I had cast your horoscope and his, and found that you would both be married about the same time, though I could not say that it would be to each other. I saw enough of him during that time in Paris to see that he was not only brave, but prudent and discreet. I saw, too, from his affection to his mistress, that he would be loyal and honest in all he undertook, that it was likely that he would rise in honour, and that, above all, I could assuredly trust your happiness to him. He was but a youth, and you a girl, but he was bordering upon manhood, and you upon womanhood. I marked this manner with his lady's daughter, and saw that she would be no rival to you. Had it been otherwise, I should have yielded to your prayers, and have kept you with me in France. Matters have turned out according to my expectation. I can give you a dowry that any English noble would think an ample one with his bride, and though Guy is now himself well endowed, he will doubtless not object to such an addition as may enable him, if need be, to place in the field a following as large as that which many of the great nobles are bound to furnish to their sovereign. I will speak to him on the subject tomorrow, Katarina." Accordingly, the next morning at breakfast, the count told Guy that there was a matter on which he wished to consult him, and the young knight remained behind when the other members of the family left the room to carry out their avocations. "Hast thought of a mistress for your new castle, Sir Guy?" the count began abruptly. Guy started at the sudden question, and did not reply at once. "I have thought of one, Count," he said, "but although so far all that you told me long ago in Paris has come true, and fortune has certainly favoured me wonderfully, in this respect she has not been kind, for the lady cares not for me, and I would not take a wife who came not to me willingly." "How know you that she cares not for you?" the count asked. "Because I have eyes and ears, Count. She thinks me but a boy, and a somewhat ill-mannered one. She mocks me when I try to talk to her, shuns being left alone with me, and in all ways shows that she has no inclination towards me, but very much the contrary." "Have you asked her straightforwardly?" the count inquired with a smile. "No, I should only be laughed at for my pains, and it would take more courage than is required to capture a great French ship for me to put the matter to her. I fancy, Sir Guy, that you are not greatly versed in female ways. A woman defends herself like a beleaguered fortress. She makes sorties and attacks, she endeavours to hide her weakness by her bravadoes, and when she replies most disdainfully to a summons to capitulate, is perhaps on the eve of surrender. To come to the point, then, are you speaking of my daughter?" "I am, Sir Count," Guy said frankly. "I love her, but she loves me not, and there's an end to it. 'Tis easy to understand that, beautiful as she is, she would not give a thought to me, who at the best can only claim to be a stout man at arms. As for my present promotion, I know that it goes for nothing in her eyes." "It may be as you say, Sir Guy, but tell me, as a soldier, before you gave up the siege of a fortress and retired, would you not summon it to surrender?" "Well, yes, I should do so," replied Guy with a smile. "Then it had better be so in this case, Sir Guy. You say that you would willingly marry my daughter. I would as willingly give her to you. The difficulty then lies with the maiden herself, and it is but fair to you both that you should yourself manfully ask her decision in the matter." The count went out of the room and returned in a minute leading Katarina. "Sir Guy has a question to ask you, daughter," he said. "I pray you to answer him frankly." He then led her to a seat, placed her there, and left the room. Guy felt a greater inclination to escape by another door than he had ever felt to fly in the hour of danger, but after a pause he said: "I will put the question, Katarina, since your father would have me do it, though I know well enough beforehand what the answer will be. I desire above all things to have you for a wife, and would give you a true and loyal affection were you willing that it should be so, but I feel only too well that you do not think of me as I do of you. Still, as it is your father's wish that I should take your answer from your lips, and as above all things I would leave it in your hands without any constraint from him, I ask you whether you love me as one should love another before plighting her faith to him." "Why do you say that you know what my answer will be, Guy? Would you have me show that I was ready to drop like a ripe peach into your mouth before you opened it? Why should I not love you? Did you not save my life? Were you not kind and good to me even in the days when I was more like a boy than a girl? Have you not since with my humours? I will answer your question as frankly as my father bade me." She rose now. "Take my hand, Guy, for it is yours. I love and honour you, and could wish for no better or happier lot than to be your wife. Had you asked me 6 months ago I should have said the same, save that I could not have given you my hand until I had my father's consent." During the next month Guy spent most of his time at Penshurst, getting everything in readiness for its mistress. Lord Eustace advanced him the monies that he was to receive for the ransoms of Count de Valor and the 5 knights, and the week before the wedding he went up with the Count of Montepone to London, and under his advice bought many rich hangings and pieces of rare furniture to beautify the private apartments. The Count laid out a still larger sum of money on Eastern carpets and other luxuries, as well as on dresses and other matters for his daughter. On jewels he spent nothing, having already, he said, a sufficient store for the wife of a royal duke. On his return Guy called upon the king at his palace at Winchester, and Henry declared that he himself would ride to Summerley to be present at the wedding. "You stood by me," the king said, "in the day of battle. It is but right that I should stand by you on your wedding day. Her father will, of course, give her away, and it is right that he should do so, seeing that she is no ward of mine. But I will be your best man. I will bring with me but a small train, for I would not inconvenience the Baron of Summerley and his wife, and I will not sleep at the castle, though I do not say that I will not stay to tread a measure with your fair bride." 2 days later a train of waggons was seen approaching Summerley. They were escorted by a body of men at arms with 2 officers of the king. Lord Eustace, in some surprise, rode out to meet them, and was informed that the king had ordered them to pitch a camp near the castle for himself and his knights, and that he intended to tarry there for the night. As soon as the waggons were unloaded, the attendants and men at arms set to work, and in a short time the royal tent and 6 smaller ones were erected and fitted with their furniture. Other tents were put up a short distance away for the grooms and attendants. This greatly relieved Lady Margaret, for she had wondered where she could bestow the king and his knights, if at the last moment he determined to sleep there. For the next 3 days the castle was alive with preparations. Oxen and swine were slaughtered, vast quantities of game, geese, and poultry were brought in. 2 stags from the royal preserves at Winchester were sent over by the king, and the rivers for miles round were netted for fish. At 10 o'clock Guy rode in with 50 mounted men, the tenants of Penshurst, Stoneham, and Piverley, and these and all the tenants of Summerley rode out under Lord Eustace and Guy to meet the king. They had gone but a mile when he and his train rode up. He had with him the Earl of Dorset and 5 of the nobles who had fought at Agincourt, and were all personally acquainted with Guy. The church at Summerley was a large one, but it was crowded as it had never been before. The king and his nobles stood on one side of the altar, while Lord Eustace, his wife, Agnes, and Charlie were on the other. Guy's tenants occupied the front seats, while the rest of the church was filled by the tenants of Summerley, their wives and daughters, and the retainers of the castle, among them Long Tom with his pretty wife beside him. When everything was in order, the Count of Montepone entered the church with his daughter, followed by the 6 prettiest maidens on the Summerley estate. "In truth, Sir Guy," the king whispered as the bride and her father came up the aisle, "your taste is as good in love as your arms are strong in war, for my eyes never fell on a fairer maid." After the ceremony there was a great banquet in the hall, while all the tenants, with their wives and families, sat down to long tables spread in the courtyard. After the meal was over and the tables removed, the king and the party in the banqueting hall went out on the steps and were received with tremendous cheering. Guy first returned thanks for himself and his bride for the welcome that they had given him, and then, to the delight of the people, the king stepped forward. "Good people," he said, "among whom there are, I know, some who fought stoutly with us at Agincourt, you do well to shout loudly at the marriage of this brave young knight, who was brought up among you, and who has won by his valour great credit and our royal favour. Methinks that he has won also a prize in his eyes even greater than the honours that we have bestowed upon him, and I doubt not that, should the occasion occur, he will win yet higher honours in our service." A great shout of "God bless the king!" went up from the assembly. Then the party returned to the hall, while casks of wine were broached in the courtyard. As Lord Eustace had sent for a party of musicians from Winchester, first some stately dances were performed in the hall, as many as could find room being allowed to come into it to witness them. The king danced the first measure with Katarina, the Earl of Dorset led out Lady Margaret, and Guy danced with Lady Agnes, while the other nobles found partners among the ladies who had come in from the neighbourhood. After a few dances the party adjourned to the courtyard, where games of various kinds, dancing and feasting, were kept up until a late hour, when the king and his companions retired to their tents. At an early hour next morning the king and his retinue rode back to Winchester. Until he signed the marriage contract before going to the church, Guy was altogether ignorant of the dowry that Katarina was to bring, and was astonished at the very large sum of money, besides the long list of jewels entered into it. "She will have as much more at my death," the count said quietly. "There is no one else who has the slightest claim upon me." Consequently, in the course of the wars with France, Guy was able to put a contingent of men at arms and archers, far beyond the force his feudal obligations required, into the field. Long Tom was, at his own request, allowed by his lord to exchange his small holding for a larger one at Penshurst, and always led Guy's archers in the wars. Sir John Aylmer remained at Summerley, refusing Guy's pressing invitation to take up his abode at Penshurst. "No, lad," he said, "Lord Eustace and I have been friends and companions for many years, and Lady Margaret has been very dear to me from her childhood. Both would miss me sorely did I leave them, the more so as Agnes is now away. Moreover, it is best that you and your fair wife should be together also for a time. 'Tis best in all respects. You have but 2 hours' easy ride from Summerley, and I shall often be over to see you." 4 years after his marriage the king promoted Guy to the rank of Baron of Penshurst, and about the same time the Count of Montepone, who had been for some months in Italy, finding that his enemies at Mantua were still so strong that he was unable to obtain a reversal of the decree of banishment that had been passed against him, returned to Penshurst. "I have had more than enough of wandering, and would fain settle down here, Guy, if you will give me a chamber for myself, and one for my instruments. I shall need them but little henceforth, but they have become a part of myself, and though no longer for gain, I love to watch the stars and to ponder on their lessons, and when you ride to the wars I shall be company for Katarina, who has long been used to my society alone, and I promise you that I will no longer employ her as my messenger." Once established at Penshurst, the count employed much of his time in beautifying the castle, spending money freely in adding to the private apartments, and decorating and furnishing them in the Italian style, until they became the wonder and admiration of all who visited them. In time he took upon himself much of the education of Katarina's children, and throughout a long life Guy never ceased to bless the day when he and Dame Margaret were in danger of their lives at the hands of the White Hoods of Paris. The end. End of chapter 20. Recording by Mike Harris. End of At Agincourt by G. A. Henty.